We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to our winter program today. We're really pleased to have two guests with us. And we're going to begin by having Vince Houghton, who is the director of the National Cryptologic Museum, curator and director of the National Cryptologic Museum, give us a little bit of an update before we go into our keynote speaker for the day. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Vince. Here we go.
Great. Hello, everyone. We've now been open a little over 4 months, so that this is a kind of a third of a year update for everyone. Hopefully you've all had the opportunity to come out and check out the museum since we've reopened. If not, please take the opportunity to do so. We'd love to have everybody there. And if you've been there and you liked it, the best thing that you can do for us is spread the word. Word of mouth right now is really our best bet for getting people in the door. And so a little bit about what's happening now. We have some upcoming events tonight, actually, but also next week. We're doing a Boys and Girls Scout night where we will have about 10 different tables from all over NSA, different organizations within NSA, who are going to do demonstrations and other hands-on activities for Girls and Boy Scouts, which will help to get them closer to some badges. Nothing will completely fill one, but a lot of the different requirements for their badges will be taken care of by this opportunity. Like everything else, this is completely free, and it's in the evening tonight and next Wednesday as well. Essentially, it's the same thing. So if you've gone to one, you don't need to go to the other. If you can't come tonight, next week is going to be an opportunity again for you to do that. We're also working on plans for both Family Day and Armed Forces Day, which is coming later in the spring. They've decided to put these back to back, one's on a Saturday and one's on a Sunday, so I can't guarantee how much or how involved we're going to be. I mean, we're certainly going to be involved. So for those of you that are formers here at NSA, you know, the Family Day is always a great opportunity, and Armed Forces Day is a huge event that unfortunately we haven't been able to do full out for the last couple of years because of COVID. I think this year there's not going to be any restrictions, and it's going to be just as big as it's been in the past. We're also working on public programming. We've started slowly because we've been busy kind of focusing on making sure the museum doesn't fall down around us. But we're slowly but surely starting to build some interesting programming for 2023. We're working with different organizations like NASA, like the International Spy Museum in Washington, the Washington Nationals, and others to work on some interesting program throughout the year. We will announce this via our website, social media, all sorts of things, but nothing is imminent right now. We're still finalizing some details. When you're dealing with multiple organizations, it's a bit like herding cats. So finding right times and dates for all this stuff is still in, it's not in the early stages, in the kind of the medium stages. So hopefully sometime soon we'll have more information, specific dates, and what kind of programming that we're doing, but there will be several this year. And eventually we're going to hope to build up to doing one every other month, if not one every month, and for 2024. But this year is going to be a little slower because of the museum opening. We've also focused on outreach. We just opened, what did I say, Wednesday, yesterday, an exhibit at the National Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas. It's about a block off the Las Vegas Strip. So lots and lots of tourists worked their way through that museum. Essentially, we sent them, we sent them an enigma because that's, what you do. But we also sent them a lot of the start verification objects. They're focused on nuclear weapons testing, on intelligence about nuclear weapons testing. So a lot of the start verification stuff that I know some of you worked on is now in Las Vegas, and it's going to get thousands of visitors going through and seeing some of the work that was done at NSA to verify start, but also some of the work done at Anders Station in Alaska about SLBM monitoring and other things. So that all is set up there in Vegas, and it'll probably be there for several months. I know I'm going out in late April to give a talk about this equipment, about these artifacts. So we're trying to work together with them. That won't be the last time we work with them. There's a lot of overlap on our mission. They have some really great people who are involved with that museum, everything from people at Area 51, the real one, not the aliens, where Lockheed Skunk Works operated, to Nellis Air Force Base, to other museums in the West Coast, where our reach really doesn't get very easily out there, and it gives us an opportunity to expand not only our name as something to visit when you come to DC, but people that can't come to DC can see a lot of our artifacts through loans that way. We also, like I mentioned, have a potential partnership with the Nationals. This is it's going to happen. We just don't know when. Finding a time, especially now when spring training starting and then the summer, where they're playing baseball almost every day, to find a way to do partnerships, whether it's programming, which we think we're actually going to do an internal and external program with the Nationals. We're going to bring them inside NSA and have them talk about codes and ciphers inside baseball to the workforce. But then we also are going to do an external program, more than likely in DC, maybe at the International Spy Museum, where we can get into the DC audience and get to fans of the team. The hope is in the future that we do this with multiple teams, including the Orioles, but even football as well, where the Ravens or the Commanders or others. This can become a series moving forward. We've also had a lot of media in the last couple of months since the last time I spoke to all of you. We've been in very large, prominent stories in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, the Baltimore Sun, other podcasts, major podcasts with hundreds of thousands of listeners. And then just recently, last Monday, we were a very large piece in the Washingtonian, which has had some pretty extraordinary results to visitorship, which continues to grow. We started slowly, now we're working our way up. We had this last Saturday, essentially a random February Saturday, over 400 visitors, which is essentially full all day from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You don't want too many more than that, because then it becomes almost too crowded. So they were all walk-ins too. Sometimes we have hundreds of people come in through tour groups or through schools, where like 4 school buses pull up. Almost every one of this 400 plus visitors were walk-ins off the street. So that broke a record that we had set earlier. The day before on Friday also broke a Friday record. It was almost 300 people. And that, I think, was due to our inclusion in this Washingtonian piece. We're also moving on developing temporary exhibits. We have one up right now that came a couple weeks ago. It's going to be through March 31st. It's about sweetheart codes. So these were the letters that were written home during World War II, where soldiers encoded messages to their wives, to their girlfriends, so that the censors wouldn't read their sweet nothings they were sending home. We kind of coincided this with Valentine's Day, and it's been a fun experience. That will be again through the end of March. After that, we have on display a really cool artifact that we discovered in our warehouse. It's a crypto and analytic device built in 1917 by William Friedman himself. It's a cool roller that allowed them to create cryptographic, essentially strips for strip ciphers. And it hasn't been on display before, and we're going to have it on display from the beginning of April for a couple months. Our larger temporary exhibit case we're scheduled to have a really interesting exhibit this summer. It's going to carry probably from Memorial Day through the end of the summer. I'm not going to tell you yet what it's going to be, but it's going to be really cool. We're putting it together. We'll have more information on that later on. And then finally, our library, which some of you know is a key component of the museum. We continue to organize. This is something that, because we had to strip it down to the bare minimum for the renovation, we now are reorganizing the library, not only what's on display, but also what's in the back. So this is an operation that if we had 30 people, we'd be done, but we don't. We have Rob and then some help. But for the most part, we're almost done with the organization of the library. We continue to digitize. We have a very, very high-tech scanner where we're able to digitize a lot of these rare books so that they can be used by people all over the world. And this includes things like the con letters. The con letters are continuing to be digitized. There were a lot of them, as many of you know. We're working our way through them so that there is a digital repository of everything that we have for the public to do both research and just if they're interested. And that's all for me, unless there are any questions.
There are. We do have a question for you. So one of the questions is, what is your plan for the restoration and reestablishment of Vigilance Park and the previous preserved airframes that were subsequently dismantled and put into outdoor storage? Yeah, so right now there's no space for it. And the reason, there's a couple of reasons for that is, one is there's where it used to be is no longer ours. Another reason is our back parking lot is now being used for multiple things, storing steel, but also there's a lot going on back there as they survey the site for one day, a new building,
which is so far off at this point that it's not really worth that conversation. But for Vigilance part, I don't know yet because we're so early in the conversations about a new location that we haven't even gotten to the point of what's going to be external. There's just really some basic conversations about what are the requirements for inside. So the aircraft themselves, we still have access to them. The naval aircraft is still up on Satellite Hill. The Army aircraft is still, it actually belongs to us. So that's something that's not even going to be sent back. The C-130 from the Air Force at Tipton, the likelihood is because it's going to be years potentially before there is a Vigilance park, that one might be rotated back to the Air Force for them to deal with. But we are having conversations at the highest levels about kind of reconstituting that at some point in the future. We just don't have the space for it right now.
Okay. I don't see any other questions coming in right now. So thank you so much. And we look forward to having you join us again at the general membership meeting coming up at a date to be named in May.
Yeah, so the May meeting, I will be able to lay out that larger temper exhibit that we're working on, and maybe some of the progress that I didn't want to bring this up in full conversation, some of the progress that we're working on with the Library of Congress to potentially get early American documents. We figured out our environmental issues, which we were having a lot of because the building is not necessarily the most modern building in the world. But with a microclimate case and with some of the other kind of museum magic we're able to do, I think we have it to a point where we can reach out to LOC and say, I think we're close to being ready. So maybe by May, I'll have a much better idea of when we're going to actually get some of these early American documents that have just never been seen before. And the LOC is very avid about getting them to us. We all have to make sure that we can protect them. And so we're working on that now.
And there was one other question that came in while you were just talking, and it was, when available, will the digitized books be at all be downloadable? Oh,
absolutely. That's the idea, right? So the idea, and we've been struggling with this because we don't have full control over our website, because NSA even doesn't have full control over their website. They contracted it out like they do. The hope is that the website can be the one-stop shop for everything, where visitors can find all the information they need about the museum. We did a 3D mapping of the entire museum that we're going to turn into essentially a 3D walkthrough of the building so that people can get an idea of what they're going to visit before they visit. We hope that we are able to put all of our lesson plans and all the curriculum that Jen has developed over the last 20 years online so that teachers around the country and around the world can use it for their classrooms. And then on the research side, we hope to have one single portal where any researcher can go to get anything digitized from us, but also CCH, D-Class, FOIA, have the one place that people can go to get everything they might possibly need for research through our website. We're not there yet. That is a long-term goal, but it's a goal that we're working on every single day.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
See you next time.
So Christine, why don't you go ahead and start to share Patrick's slides, and then I will introduce him. So Patrick Weadon, and first of all, before I begin, I just want to make sure everybody knows that we did have some technical difficulties. We couldn't get our camera to work and feed through the computer. We're not sure what happened with that, but in the meantime, we'll work on that for the next program. And so we had to suddenly scramble and do it off of our computers and using the camera off of my office computer. So thus the scrambling that's going on. So now I will introduce Patrick. Patrick Weadon served as the curator of the National Security Agency's National Cryptologic Museum from January 2005 to September of 2020. Prior to his appointment as the chief of the museum, Mr. Weadon spent 20 years at NSA, where he served in such diverse positions as special agent, intelligence research analyst, and public affairs officer. He also served on active duty with the United States Navy in the days and months following September 11, 2001. Patrick joins us today to talk about his recent book, Night Raid on Truk, Bill Martin, Joe Doyle, VT-10, and the first U.S. Navy nighttime carrier raid. Welcome, Patrick.
I want to extend my personal thanks to the foundation, to Ms. Nelson, to the leadership, the board, but we have a pretty good group from what Ms. Hardy has told me. And there are people out there who I'm speaking to right now who were an indelible help to me during my time as curator If I start naming names, I'll never get through the briefing. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your help, because it really was indispensable. This book was a labor of love, and again, it's a great honor to be able to present it to you today. I'd like to give you just a brief summary before I begin with the official slides. On 17 February, as part of Operation Hailstone, 12 pilots and air crews of the USS Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron VT-10 took off from the deck of the USS Enterprise. That was not unusual. Men had been taking off from the decks of U.S. Navy ships for 2 decades. The reason the 12 merit special attention is that for the very first time, they were attempting to conduct a low-level radar-guided bombing attack under the cover of darkness. Previously, there had been efforts by U.S. Navy pilots to conquer the night, but on 17 February, the 12 pilots who were catapulted off the deck of the Enterprise were attempting something unprecedented. The nocturnal raid was the culmination in bringing to fruition of an idea formulated by a true aviation pioneer, Bill Martin, whose overall creative vision and inventive uses of technology would mesh with the courage and bravery of his men to make U.S. naval and aviation history. In 2009, Cliff Largess, one of the 12, at a Veterans Day ceremony in his hometown of Jamestown, New York, noted, "We took off in the dead of night. The results were spectacular. We had the evidence that night flights could be done. The approach caught on, and within a year, most of the aircraft could fly at night. We were truly pioneers." Indeed, they were. Night Raid on Truk covers the groundbreaking events of that night, as well as the individuals, events, implements of war, and technology that led to the success of the raid. In addition, it utilizes the oral histories of Martin, whose vision and hard work brought the mission to fruition, and of Joseph Doyle, one of the 12 pilots who participated in the raid to bring the events of that night to life. Ms. Harding, if I could have the slide of Joe Doyle, please. I'm sure it will be coming up anytime now. Technical gremlins. Let me see. You can go with Plan B here. There we go. It's the one that right here. The one of the pilot. Next one. There we go. Good job. All right. This is a picture of my uncle, Joseph Anthony Doyle. It's a picture of him when he was on the Enterprise. He was born in 1920 in the Bronx, New York. His father was a veteran of World War I. He served with the 77th Division. He was an artilleryman. And his maternal grandfather had been in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. He was a child of the Depression. His father, I counted them up, he traveled to 15 different places during the 1930s in an attempt to find work. So the family was really going up and down the East Coast. But finally, my grandfather, Joseph Anthony Doyle's father senior, Joseph Anthony Doyle Sr., was able to get a good job in the Washington area, and he was able to move his family to Chevy Chase. Now, to this day, I haven't been able to figure out how he went from being this itinerant salesman. He was someone who was selling appliances, radios, and all kinds of new electrical appliances were coming online. But he found a good job with an organization called the Electrical Institute. And he was able to buy a home in Chevy Chase. And Joe Doyle at that point got some stability in his life. And he was a very good student. He attended Bethesda Chevy Chase High School. And he was able to gain acceptance to Georgetown. And he graduated in the Georgetown class of 1941. Now, he had listened to stories from both his grandfather and father about Army life. And while he wasn't frail or somebody that was afraid to face challenges, he decided when the draft became part of the scene, that was actually before Pearl Harbor, that if he was going to go in the service, and he knew eventually he would, He wanted to go into the Navy where you could get 3 hot meals and sleep on clean sheets. So he was intent on joining the Navy, and he wanted to get ahead of the curve before he was going to be inducted. So he went to the recruiting office on M Street in Georgetown, and he walked in and he said, "I'm a college graduate and I would like to be in the Navy." And they asked to see his transcript, and he presented it to them. And they told him, "Mr. Doyle, you did very well at Georgetown, but you don't have enough math to be a surface warfare officer. And because of that, we really don't, need you." And my uncle was extremely upset because he'd had his heart on going into the Navy, and he persisted and he said, "Look, I'm a college graduate, I have some talents and abilities. Isn't there anything else I can do in the Navy?" And the recruiter looked at him and said, "Well, you might want to try V5. And my uncle said, "What's V5? He said, "Aviation. They're over in Anacostia." So he had no thought of being a pilot. He wasn't somebody that, yearned for being off in the wild blue. He was just somebody that was trying to get into the Navy. So he indeed went down to Anacostia the next day, and they accepted him. Now, I've always thought that you needed more math to be a pilot than a surface warfare officer, but apparently the Navy thinks differently. He was in very good shape, and apparently he impressed the people down at V5. And so he was accepted into the aviation program. Now, the way it worked was they did some general training up in the Washington, D.C. area. They were flying out of a airport around Alexandria for their initial training because they wanted them to be able to fly a plane before they got down to Pensacola. Even before he went into the program officially, he went out to Gaithersburg Airport, which is now gone. It's subsumed by suburbia, and he actually taught himself to fly. So he was well prepared, and he was in this pilot training program for about a month. One of the points I want to make here, though, is that, and this was a story that was repeated over and over and over again. Joe Doyle is someone who is thinking about working at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and going to law school at night. And he realizes he's going to get drafted. And all of a sudden, he finds himself in these incredibly difficult and challenging situations. He's going to become a pilot, and he's going to go into the Pacific. So many people came from, I guess you would call average walks of life. And all of a sudden, they're, again, faced with these immense challenges. If you've ever seen the movie The Best Years of Our Lives, it really emphasizes this. So one quick story. During his training, before he goes down to Pensacola, Ms. Hardy, if you could give me the next slide, please. There we go. This is 3711 Shepherd Street in beautiful Chevy Chase, Maryland. It's the springtime, you can tell from the azaleas. This is the house that was purchased by my grandfather. It's the house where my mother and my aunts grew up. It's where I grew up. And of course, it's where my Uncle Joe grew up. His bedroom was at the very top window. The last day of training, when they were flying out of the airport at Alexandria, and they're in these little tiny training planes, he had been going up and doing this figure 8 pattern over the airport, and he was bored with it. And this is very unlike my uncle, who never broke any rules. But he decided the last day that it would be a good idea to fly out to Chevy Chase and see what his house looked like from the air. So he could navigate by terrain feature. Connecticut Avenue wasn't hard to find. And he broke off from the pack and flew out Connecticut Avenue, and he actually buzzed the house. My grandmother was beating a rug out of the 2 windows on the right, and flew by the house and thought it was really neat. The problem was when he landed at the airport, the officer of the day was there to greet him. And he said, "Doyle, were you up in number 23 today?" And my uncle said, "Yes, I was." He goes, "Well, the old man wants to see you." He went in to see Captain Freudenheim, who had been responsible for getting him into the program. And Freudenheim said, "What in the world were you thinking? I have 15 different reports of a plane out in Chevy Chase." Well, thankfully, they didn't throw him out of the Navy, largely because I guess he was headed to ship out to Pensacola the next day. But he does head out to Pensacola, and the adventure begins. He's going to be he's going to get his wings, and he's going to be sent out to the South Pacific to prepare to be assigned to a permanent squadron. Next slide, please. Doyle will eventually meet up with a gentleman who you see pictured here. That is a very formal picture, and it's Bill Martin. Bill Martin was just an incredibly innovative person, and the reason that he's so important to this story is, unlike my uncle, he had wanted to be a pilot his whole life. He was from Missouri, again, which is in the middle of the country, lots of farming, lots of agriculture. He spent a lot of time in fields. Working, and every now and then he'd look up and see this beautiful airplane, and he would say, someday I'm going to be up there. He originally thought about becoming a doctor, attended the University of Missouri for a while, but then he was able to kind of switch gears. He got an appointment to Annapolis, and he graduated in the class of 1934. Very important to mention, Martin became captain of the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Academy swim team. He became an expert swimmer, and that will serve him well in many, many instances in the future. Like a lot of young officers, he was assigned to battleships initially, but he wants to get his wings. That's the most important thing to him, and he's able to earn them at Pensacola in 1938. One of the things that Martin was thinking about, really even before he got into the thick of the Pacific War, was we need to be able to train pilots so they can operate in every condition, in every situation. That means bad weather, good weather, and both in daytime and most especially at nighttime. Pilots have to be adept not only at being able to fly by their instruments, but being able to use a wide range of technological instruments and devices to be able to gain an advantage on the enemy. It's important to note that he really is a lone wolf in this regard. There really isn't anybody, at least on record, that is obsessed with this issue as much as Martin is. He really wants to bring this to fruition. We're going to find out as we go along that he's going to be, he's not going to be, this idea is not going to be welcomed by the Navy. He becomes the commander of a scouting squadron, and then eventually he demonstrates some strong leadership, and he's given command of a dive bombing squadron. Also, during the time that he's on the Enterprise, an incident occurs with Butch O'Hare. Now, a lot of people fly into O'Hare Airport in Chicago. They have no idea why it's called O'Hare. It's named after Butch O'Hare, who was the very first ace in the Pacific. And I think one day he shot down 4 planes in a 24-hour period. And Butch O'Hare, like Martin, was somebody that not only thought that night operations were possible, but actually put together an operation that unfortunately during that operation, he lost his life. Martin was aboard the Enterprise. He was aware that O'Hare was also exploring the possibility, and he was very upset that it didn't work out. And he immediately began to think about ways that he could adjust it so that it could actually work. But one of the things he also realized was that you're not going to be able to conduct night operations without a plane that can have a radar in it. And the only plane that was large enough, carrier-based plane anyway, that the Navy had was the Avenger. Just a quick note here. This is from his oral history. Martin noted, I wrote my first letter on night tactics that we should be working on that while I was in this dive bombing squadron. And the interviewer says, you were a lone eagle, so to speak. Martin said, yes, I was not getting very much encouragement. And the fact is, I was getting some considerable discouragement from the people at the top. My uncle noted Martin had to fight very hard until something happened, like Butch O'Hare, who was killed at night. And the question came up, why were we not better to handle what happened? Some suggested Butch O'Hare was killed by friendly fire. So this subject sort of smoldered, and there were people in the Navy back at the Pentagon who studied the subject. And one of the things that crystallized the matter was the only way to use planes at night was the development of radar. It is one thing to go out and fly a plane on instruments. You can do that. But what do you do once you're out there? Where is the enemy? Radar became an instrument for answering that question. So Bill made connections with people like Henry Loomis. Loomis was a known officer, scientific trainee, who was very interested in developing radar. They became friendly. Loomis was one of the crewmen in Bill's airplane when he went on some of his night flights. So in addition to developing a plane that made sense at night and getting technical training, Bill was an incredible factor in connecting with Loomis. They were both thinking along the same lines. Here's the goal. They wanted to use the planes fully so that during a day's operation, considering a substantial attack on the enemy target, you could have the carrier starting off at dawn, heading into the wind and launching planes. It could recover some of the distance, but not a great deal. The planes were not in the air more than a couple of hours, so they could come back. Here's really what Martin's trying to do. If you've ever watched a boxing match, boxing is kind of falling out of favor now, but it was once the country's most popular sport. Fighters go at each other, and sometimes you'll notice that one of them is getting beat up pretty badly. And what they're waiting for is the sound of the bell. When the bell rings, you can go back to your corner, you can get water, they can revive you, and you live to survive another round. But what Martin wanted to do was he didn't want to give the Japanese any kind of a rest. Japan actually had a substantive night flying program. Now, it wasn't necessarily based on technical aspects like the one Martin was thinking of, but they had the ability to attack at night. But Martin wanted to be able to hit them at 24 hours a day so that they never got a rest. And he believed that night operations could help him do that. Next slide, Ms. Hardy. That is a more operational picture, I guess you could say, of Martin. And next slide, please. And that's Martin with the air crew on his Avenger. He really was an incredible person with a great vision, and he was able to bring it to fruition. Okay, next slide, Ms. Hardy. The third person that I want to talk about before we start to begin to focus on the ship and the plane is Charlie Henderson. Charlie Henderson's nickname was Hotshot, and it was an appropriate moniker. He was from Maryland. He was from one of the oldest families in Maryland, and their ancestral mansion, which is still there, was in Trap, down on the Eastern Shore. If you drive to Ocean City, you go through the town of Trap. Back a little bit, Christine. There you go. One of the most interesting things that happened to my uncle and his adventures in the South Pacific was he met Charlie Henderson. They were in Pensacola together, and they were part of the same unit for the entire war, which was extremely unique. Not just the Navy, but the services in general. They're not really fond of having people serve together for that length of time. But the reason that Henderson is also important is he was, I guess, on a positive side, you would call him the consummate warrior. On the downside, you would say that he was a little bit crazy and could get people killed. Henderson was someone that just yearned for action, and he was constantly trying to take the fight to the enemy. My uncle said of him, he was one of the most adventurous people I've ever met. Adventurous people are not necessarily good company or safe company, but they can be of tremendous value in a military situation. Now, I'm going to tell you something now, and it's going to become important again later on in the brief. When you are at Pensacola, at least during this time, you were going to be assigned to, at least in the track that my uncle was in and Henderson were in, you were going to be assigned one of three planes. You were going to become a fighter. A fighter plane is, you're a single pilot, you're out there alone. A dive bomber, where you have a pilot and a turret gunner and radio operator. And then you have an Avenger, which has a crew of 3. It has a turret gunner, a radio man, and the pilot. But the Avenger is a much slower aircraft than the other 2. In fact, if you were an Avenger pilot, they would often say that you flew low and slow. And Henderson wanted to be a fighter pilot. That's what he felt he deserved. When he was assigned to torpedo planes, he was not happy at all. And he complained about it throughout the war. So keep that in mind. But Hotshot Henderson is going to be a big part of not only VT-10, but the raid as well. Next slide, Ms. Hardy. Before you is the USS Enterprise, CV-6. That means it was the 6th carrier built. James Forrestal, the former Secretary of the Navy, said, "The Enterprise is the one ship that most nearly symbolizes the history of the United States Navy in World War II." It was built in 1936, largely with money and programs generated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And it would be the 7th ship of the U.S. Navy, and this goes back to colonial times, to carry the name Enterprise. One of the most important things about the ship is Barrett Tillman, who's a famous naval historian who wrote a wonderful book on the Avenger. He called it a floating leadership factory. The crew was handpicked. New sailors coming aboard entered an environment of experience and accomplishment. One of the points I'd like to make here is that, and I believe the Navy even does it today, you've got the carrier and you've got the crew who handles the ship, does all the things that an aircraft carrier has to do. But the air group, which are the pilots and the other individuals who are part of it, they're separate and they get assigned to a carrier. Martin was ecstatic when Air Group 10, which is what he was a part of, was assigned to the Enterprise, because he felt that it was the best possible ship that they could work with. And again, he's going to be associated with the Enterprise. Air Group 10 is going to be associated with the Enterprise for a good long while. And like the ship, Air Group 10 is going to accomplish some great things. Part of the reason they're going to be successful is because they happen to be assigned to the Enterprise at the time. Now, we're going to talk about the Enterprise, certainly at Truk and in other situations, but it's important to note that one of the reasons people had such a high opinion of the ship, and it was the most decorated ship in World War II, was that it seemed to be everywhere that action was called for. It played a critical role in Midway, but Midway would only be the beginning of the ship's accomplishments. She would go on to make substantive contributions during the Guadalcanal, Solomon, and Gilbert Island campaigns. And at one point in 1942 and 43, she was the only active carrier in the Solomon Islands theater of operations. Again, the reason the ship is so important is because it provides the support and the environment for the air group of which VT-10 was a part to be so successful. Next slide, Ms. Hardy, please. Before you is the moniker of VT-10 or Torpedo 10, and they were called the Buzzard Brigade. Mop them up. He's carrying a mop. The Buzzard is carrying a mop. The air group consisted again of 3 types of planes. You had the fighters, you had the dive bombers, and then you had the torpedo squadron, which again was headed up by Martin. Now, I'm going to focus exclusively, or not exclusively, but largely on the part that VT-10 played in the first nighttime raid. But they had a long and illustrious record throughout the Pacific campaign. VT-10 was the torpedo squadron of Air Group 10. They would distinguish themselves throughout the war, but it is important to point out that they were not a night torpedo group. What they were was a daytime torpedo group, which was the norm, who had a commander that also took time to train his people on nighttime operations. Martin is doing this really out of whole cloth on his own. And, you know, again, some of the men are mystified by this, but one of the, my uncle noted that they knew that at some point they probably were going to be on a nighttime mission. They just didn't know when. But it was hard enough to be a torpedo pilot in the Pacific and to do all the things you needed to do and to be trained for what you needed to be trained on. But in addition to that, Martin would take the time, and he's actually going to be given the time at one point to really train them up, not just on daytime operations, but nighttime operations. But I want to make it clear that it wasn't until later in the war that you had official nighttime squadrons like Torpedo or like Torpedo 10. Okay, next picture, please. This is a picture of VT-10's officer corps. My uncle is in the second row. But remember, it's not just the pilots. The pilots were the officers. You had a pilot who was in charge of the plane. And then you also had the enlisted people who took care of myriad tasks. Again, you had the turret gunner, and you also had the person in the middle of the plane. We're going to get to that in a minute, who also had incredible challenges to make it all work. Next slide, please, Ms. Harding. This is the entire cadre, and again, I believe this is in Hawaii, and you can see it's a rather large and enthusiastic group. One of the things that I noticed, and I love this picture, is everybody is smiling, even though they're about to meet with incredible challenges. Okay, next slide. Now, there were any number of different elements that made this work, and we're going to talk about each one of them. Certainly, the Enterprise provided the foundation. Martin had the vision, but it would have never worked without the Avenger. The Avenger was named so because it was supposed to avenge Pearl Harbor. Now, if we go back to the Battle of Midway and we think about a very famous squadron, VT-8, or Torpedo 8, who flew off the Hornet, they got annihilated. And one of the reasons they got annihilated was we really hadn't developed our tactics yet. Our fighters were not up to the task, although they did fairly well at Midway. The Japanese Zero was a superior plane at the time, but they were flying an aircraft, a torpedo plane called the Devastator. Now, when the Devastator was first brought online in 1930, it was a top-of-notch airplane, state-of-the-art. But by the 1940s, it had become somewhat of a dinosaur. It did not have self-sealing gas tanks, which is incredibly important. And one of the reasons that the Devastators just did not accomplish much of anything during the Battle of Midway, despite the courage and bravery of the pilots. I don't want to take away from their courage to carry the fight to the enemy. But it was not a good plane simply because it was outmoded, and the Avenger was supposed to be the answer to that, the solution to it. Again, it was not only a torpedo plane, but a bomber. It was called a torpedo bomber. It was a very versatile aircraft. The newly minted Avenger carried a crew of 3, pilot, gunner, and radio operator. It had a 1900 horsepower motor. It was the largest carrier aircraft with a length of 40 feet, a height of 16 feet 5 inches, and a wingspan of 54 feet. It weighed 10,545 pounds. Without its crew and armaments, and loaded 17,895 pounds. It had a maximum speed, and this is important, of 276 miles per hour. Now, 276 miles per hour is pretty fast, but a Navy Hellcat fighter could travel at 380 and a Japanese Zero at 320. So they really were versatile aircraft. They were sturdy. Again, they had self-sealing gas tanks. But compared to other aircraft, they were slow. Now, Grumman originally built the Avenger, but Grumman had a lot on its plate. They were turning out any number of different aircraft, and they needed to get their production numbers up, and they weren't able to pay as much attention to cranking out the Avenger. So the solution was, we've got to find another manufacturing entity that can manufacture this plane. Well, guess who needs work? Guess who needs contract? Automobile companies, particularly General Motors. General Motors went to the government and said, we would like to take a crack at building this aircraft. We believe we can do it. They eventually got the contract and they were able to begin to crank out the Avengers. The factories of Detroit and elsewhere that made cars would now be making planes, tanks, and other badly needed implements of war. It would take time to retool. And in the meantime, the employees would be going with badly needed paychecks. The best way to keep the wheels of the industry rolling was to pursue government contracts. There were any number of innovative things that General Motors did. They struggled at the beginning, but eventually their engineers were able to get it right. At one point, they took an Avenger, Grumman, and they put it together with fasteners and then forwarded to General Motors so the engineers could take off each part and look at it and begin to manufacture the plane. This required a huge retooling to the point where there were factories in places like Linden, New Jersey, where they actually had to raise the roof of the factory in order to produce the aircraft. The bottom line is, though, at one point, General Motors begins to be the main manufacturer of it. On November 11th, 1942, the aircraft made its maiden flight. The event was highly anticipated, not only for reasons of celebrating the arrival of a new and improved torpedo bomber, but because it was a success and proved that automakers could build planes. TBM, the M standing for General Motors, as noted, the manufacturer, the planes built by that corporation would be labeled TBF. So if it was built by Grumman, it's TBF. If it's General Motors, it's TBM. However, it's worth noting that while both versions of the planes were built by two different entities, the parts were interchangeable. By the end of the war, close to 10,000 Avengers would be built. Of those, 7,546 were turned out by GM. So just to recap, we've got the right ship, we've got the right person with a vision, and now we've got the right plane. Next slide, Miss Harding. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's 5 of the air crew. These were the enlisted men. And again, if you've served any time in the military, the way it's supposed to work is officers, they plan, they lead. Sometimes they have to get down in the dirt and do the dirty work, but most of the time, and I know I'm generalizing, there's probably some officers out there saying, I did the dirty work as well. God bless you. But most of the time, the hard work, the really tough stuff falls on the enlisted people. There's a tendency to focus on the pilots. You know, I say the 12 pilots that were chosen, but it's really the air crews, because without the work of these individuals, the Avenger could have never done its job. Just a quick story involving my uncle. This was after the raid on Truk, but they had been during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. My uncle and his crew had just dropped a bomb and severely damaged a Japanese aircraft carrier, but it was getting dark. And they were heading back to the Enterprise. And of course, they had experience as night fighters. But the problem was they were running out of gas. And all of the aircraft that had been on the raid, and a lot of people were starting to ditch and to drink. My uncle notes that Don Falk, who was a turret gunner, called me up and said, Lieutenant, I was a mechanic. I worked in the hangar deck with the engines for a long time. And I found out if you operate the engine at much higher pressure and a lower propeller setting, you can save gas. The engine will heat up, but the gas saving can be significant. And my uncle said, okay, Don, I'll do it. And guess what? They were the only plane that made it back to the Enterprise that night. The others either had to ditch or to land on other aircraft carriers. I tell that story because it really was teamwork. These individuals were really the ones that made it go. Now, the pilot had to fly the plane, but it required supporting personnel to communicate, navigate, and put suppressive fire on attacking aircraft. On a B-17 bomber, this was accomplished with a crew of 10. pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, navigator, ball turret gunner, right gunner, left gunner. The Avenger was not nearly as large, but the crew operated in 3 different sections. The pilot sat in the front section and flew the aircraft. Behind him, there was an armored bulkhead where you had the radio man and radar operator. And then finally, the person up in the turret gunner. All of the communication was done via radio or intercom. So in order to achieve victory, any armed force must be able to shoot, move, and communicate. The duties of the average Avenger radio man were many and varied, but the enlisted men who served in that role and flew with Martin's Nightbirds not only had to be competent in their usual duties, but also literally serve as the eyes of the pilot in darkness. This author often wonders how they did it. These crews were involved, along with the pilots, of course, in intensive training. In July of 1943, Martin forms VT-10, and he immediately begins the process of training them not only again to fight during the day, but also to fight at night. And they initially began their training in Seattle, Washington, which is a very good place to teach pilots how to fly by their instruments because there's fog all the time. They were all outstanding instrument pilots, but Martin also wanted to put them in situations that they would be sure to meet. And one of them was when you're a night flyer and you're out on a night operation, you've got to be able to locate your target, and that's going to be done with the radar. But you also have to be able to deal with other challenges, one of which was searchlights. If a searchlight hits your plane, it really destroys your night vision and causes additional problems. So in addition to the training, which took place in Seattle, he moved the unit to, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Puunene. All of you Hawaiian experts out there can pronounce it properly. Naval Air Station on the island of Maui during November and December 1943, and he put the group through an intense training regimen. A typical day started at 0300 hours. For the next 7 hours, pilots and crew would undergo an ongoing series of lengthy navigation, tracking flights, and intense exercises. On November 28th and 29th, he put them through an actual exercise, and it went exceedingly well. They took on the 28th, the group took about 11 minutes to find their target. On the 29th, the group found the objectives even faster. Joe Doyle was the one who found it that day. All but one of the 12 planes found the targets on their radars, and all the runs were conducted under radar control. Most impressively, the pilots appeared to have developed a strong level of confidence in their radar operators' ability to find the targets. At the end of the exercise, all planes returned to base on their own recognizance and landed well before dawn. This proved to Martin not only that this was possible, but that the individuals that he had under his command were ready to do it. None of this would have been able to happen without, next slide, please, Ms. Harding, the ASB radar. So I'm going to backtrack again. We've got the right ship, we've got the right plane, we've got the right person with the vision to make this happen. We've got highly trained pilots, but these crews, these air crews, are not going to be able to find what they need to find in the dark unless you've got, number one, an effective radar, and number two, somebody who's highly trained and knows how to use it. Now, the exercises on the 28th and the 29th showed that they had accomplished this. Just a word about the ASB radar. The Navy had been experimenting with the radar since 1930, but it would not be to the end of that decade that a contract would be given to RCA. The bottom line is, in simple terms, radio waves reflect off metal objects. Using this concept, if one can produce short pulses of radio energy in time on an oscilloscope, it becomes possible to use the determined range along with the direction of the antenna to get what we call a fix. First manufactured in 1942, the ASB radar was a product of the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, which did incredible work, still does today, and was a general surface search device that could be used for both navigation and for finding targets, particularly the enemy at sea. So again, all of these elements are coming together. Now, as noted, the Enterprise and VT-10 had been involved in combat operations long before they got to Truk. But next slide, please. They're going to be involved in Operation Hailstone. And this is when Martin is finally going to get his chance. Operation Hailstone, 17-18 February, was a United States Navy air and surface attack conducted as part of the drive against the Imperial Japanese Navy through the Central Pacific. Many of you are probably familiar with how the Pacific War was prosecuted, but the way it worked was they would pick out a particular island or atoll. They would, the Marines would normally land. They would have to subdue the Japanese garrisons with great cost. Just as an example, Iwo Jima, there's 20,000 Japanese troops on Iwo Jima when the battle starts. 2 months later, there's less than 500. So the Marines really took it on the chin. But once the Marines do their work, which they did very well time and time again, the Seabees come in. They build an airstrip. Here come the aircraft. If you dominate the sky, you dominate the high ground, and you can then move to the next objective. And this happened. They didn't do it to every Pacific island. They picked out certain ones, and they knew that the ones that they didn't have to attack would eventually die on the vine because you would cut the supply line. It's important to note that Truk was considered the Gibraltar of the Japanese Navy. It was their Pearl Harbor. And for much of the war, many of their capital ships operated out of Truk. But just a word about Operation Hailstone. Unlike Tarawa, this was going to be Truk would be a purely Navy show. Admiral Ray Spruance, one of the heroes of the Battle of Midway, and in my opinion, probably one of the most important people in World War II, was told to hit Truk with everything he could in concert with Vice Admiral Mark Mitzer. They devised and implemented Operation Hailstone. It would be carried out by Task Force 58, a massive naval force that included the Enterprise, the Yorktown, the Essex, the Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and 4 light carriers. TF-58 was probably the largest naval force assembled by the United States up to that time, and the decks of the carriers involved and had the capability to launch 500 aircraft at opposition forces. The carriers were also supported by 7 battleships, an array of heavy and light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Back to Truk. Next slide, please. That is Truk. Now, this is you can see it looks like an atoll which is surrounded by a coral reef. That is a huge area. It's about 40 miles, so large, in fact, that the Japanese could conduct aerial, or rather naval maneuvers within it. There are 2 islands, actually there's a smattering of islands, but on those islands were a large collection of Japanese combat aircraft. In some ways, Truk's reputation was well-deserved. The Japanese had been using it as a headquarters and staging area for operations for a long while. There were a host of planes and airfields that could threaten any American task force. The installation consisted of a 30 to 40 mile wide lagoon surrounded by a large sheltering circular relief, so large that on several occasions the Navy conducted major naval exercises. Due to its sheltering harbor since the 1940s, Truk had served as a location for Japan's combined fleet. At any given time, it would not have been unusual to find a collection of their largest ships operated there. 2 large anchorage areas lay between the larger islands of Moan, Dublin, and Itan, which are the 3 main ones. And there were 5 airfields scattered throughout the atoll. Taking this into account, it was not surprising that the officers and men of Air Group 10 and the Enterprise were very wary of Truk. One of the most important things that came out of the Pacific War was that Billy Mitchell's vision really became it became the fact. And what Billy Mitchell said was that an airplane, even a tiny airplane with the right bomb, could take out the largest ship. And they scoffed at him. But what they were afraid of was that the number of aircraft on Truk would be able to locate ships within the task force and destroy them. So what Spruance and Mitchell want to do is they want to hit Truk before they can actually mount any type of an attack. They, at the time, again, considered this to be a huge Gibraltar-like fortress. And there was great consternation about having to attack Truk because of the reputation that it had. Now, here's the real story. It was a giant that had feet of clay. And what happened was, at one point, about 2 or 3 weeks before Task Force 58 approached Truk, there were capital ships of the United States Navy in their harbors, but there was a Marine reconnaissance flight that flew over. The Japanese recognized it, they went after it, but the reconnaissance flight got away. And once the Japanese admirals realized that the Americans had located where their capital ships were, they moved them. Now, Mitzer and Spruance don't know this, so they're hoping to not only destroy Truk, but they're hoping to destroy all of the biggest ships that Japan has. They don't know that they're gone, but that's not going to stop them. So on the 17th, 90 miles from their objective, Mitchell loosed the dogs of war on Truk. At sunrise, they launched the first nonstop air attacks. It would continue for 2 straight days. 72 Hellcat fighters, led by the legendary fighter pilot Killer Kane, would arrive over the objective. But when they got there, they were very disappointed the capital ships were not there. It didn't matter, though, because as I'm going to note in a minute, there were tons and tons of merchant ships. There were tankers, oil tankers. There were ammunition ships. As we all know, logistics is what really matters. And so even though the capital ships were gone, it was good hunting, as they say. Now, most importantly, shortly before Truk, Martin had been going to the admirals, going through the chain of command. Let me do a night operation. My people are trained. Let me do it. Let me do it. No, 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 it'll never work. It'll never work. Finally, they grant permission. And Martin, shortly before they begin operations on Truk, tells them that they're going to be actually conducting their first nighttime raid, guided by the radar. I want to stress again, this was a daytime torpedo group that had been trained to fight at night, and now they were going to get the chance to do it. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the pilots and crews were roused from their bunks. It was time to go to work. Martin divided the pilots and air crews into 3 divisions, which would be led by the senior pilots, Eason, William Baldwin, and Lieutenant Nelson. Pilots, man your planes sounded. Now, important point, and this just shows you that you don't always get what you deserve in life. A week before the raid, Bill Martin is conducting calisthenics on the deck. He slips and he injures his elbow, which means he will not be able to fly on this raid. It's like Moses being denied the promised land. He went to everybody on the ship, including the captain, and he said, look, I can fly, I can fly. They said, okay, well, let's see you get up into the cockpit and operate the controls. He got up and he was able to manipulate the controls with his right hand, but you can't just fly with one hand, you have to use both. And when he tried to hit tabs with his left, he couldn't do it. So they told him, Mr. Martin, you are not going to be going on the raid. And it must have been a huge disappointment. But in a way, this is a huge credit to Bill Martin, because he had these people so well trained. He went to Commander Eason at the time. He went to Commander Eason at the time, and he said, you're going to lead the group. And this was ironic because Eason was one of the biggest skeptics of night flying. He was always complaining about why they had to do the extra training. But Eason was chosen. He was a tall individual from Mississippi, very aggressive guy. And, you know, it must have broken Martin's heart to not be able to go on this raid. And before they got into their planes, he took a moment to give the group one last pep talk. His voice was a mixture of emotion, sadness, and bravado. He drove home the point that this was an historic mission. Now, It's important to note that they did not take off as you do in a normal operation on aircraft carrier. They were catapulted off. Even back then, they had catapults, not as advanced as the ones the Navy has today. But I once asked my uncle, I said, Uncle Joe, you went through an awful lot in the Pacific. Was there any time where you were scared? And he said, no, not really. He said, but the one thing I hated was sitting there in the dark, waiting to be catapulted off. And you would often think to yourself, what the hell am I doing here? And sometimes it would take a couple of minutes and you would just ponder your situation. And of course, you're going to be thrown off into the pitch black darkness of night, and then you're going to have to move toward your target. So the 12 are eventually all catapulted off. They form up and they have about an 80-mile flight to Truk. Now, if you read the after action reports and other people who've covered this, it was a beautiful night. And if they hadn't been going into a situation where they could have all lost their lives, they probably would have enjoyed the beautiful tropic weather. It was like a scene from Michener's South Pacific, but they're not worried about that. Now, when they get to Truk, if you could look at the map here, one group is going to go at around 2 o'clock, the other is going to go at 11 o'clock, and the third one is going to go kind of in the middle. This is the most important point about the operation. They were afraid if more than one of them went into the anchorages, they would be shot down by friendly fire. So each pilot is given a chance to go across on their own. And so they circle the atoll, and then when it's their turn, they get the call, and then they go across and they look for targets. This is how it went. Now, each plane comes across, they were able to locate myriad targets, and really they met with great success. But I want to tell one story that I think is really interesting. Next slide, please. That's Truk. Next slide, please. There we go. Joe Doyle finally gets the call. It's his time to go across the anchorage. And as he enters the anchorages, the radar man gets on the intercom and says, Lieutenant, we've got a big, huge ship right in front of us. Let's get ready. They get the bombs ready. And the way it worked was you would fly over the target and you would say 1 alligator, 2 alligator, and then you'd hit the switch that would drop the bombs. So they're thinking that they're going to get a big, huge ship. And when they got within about 400 yards of it, boom, these massive lights come on, and my Uncle Joe is looking at the cross on the hospital ship. And he hesitated for 2 seconds, and then he decided not to drop on the ship, and he flew off and went out and came back around again. But again, it's an incredibly interesting story. This ship had been captured by the Japanese at the Battle of the Java Sea. It was originally a Dutch ship, and they converted it into a hospital ship. It actually survived the war. My uncle did tell me that Charlie Henderson noted if it had been him, he would have dropped the bomb, for good or for bad. Again, each plane goes through and they meet with huge success. I'm going to read the after action report in a minute, which details how well they actually did. Toward the end, though, the Japanese start to focus in on their exhaust pipes. And the artillery fire is getting, the anti-aircraft fire is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. They were only in there for 45 minutes, but they did incredible damage. And unfortunately, the last person through, Lieutenant Nichols, he was from Minnesota. My uncle spoke very well of him. He was felled by anti-aircraft fire. He was the only, or they were the only crew that were killed that night. Next slide. Having completed their mission, the raiders, save for Nichols and his crew, met up approximately 5 miles from the southeast corner of the atoll and in small groups made their way back to the carrier. By 5055, all planes had been recovered and the crew were safely aboard. As the last plane touched down on the flight deck, the sun was coming up over the horizon. They had performed their mission entirely in darkness and had proved that the night would no longer be an impediment to carrying the fight to the enemy. That morning, the chosen 12 and their crew could take immense pride in knowing that their mission had been a sterling success. All right, I'm going to read this here, and it's a lot of it is, for want of a better term, military ease, but you'll get the point. This squadron has specialized in night radar search and attack, and specifically requested this mission. It is believed that this was the first time that carrier forces have launched a night radar minimum altitude bombing attack. It is hoped that its success will encourage its future employment. The efficacy of the attack is best demonstrated by the following: 25 drops, resulting in 52% or 13 direct hits, 28% on 7 probable hits, and 20 or 5 uncovered or unobserved drops or misses. For purposes of this report, probable hits are defined as explosions occurring not over a beam width from the target and in connection with the several drops. It must be understood that hits may have occurred which did not result in extensive explosions. An elevation on the basis of the sortie cruise shows 108% direct hits, or 13 hits for 12 sorties, as one plane did not return, and results of hits attained by, okay, let me go to this part here. The figure of 108% direct hits by flight compares most favorably with the percentage of hits attained by daylight flight in this operation, the highest being 16%. The nature of the night attack, which permits quick retirement beyond accurate range and lack of interception by fighters, makes it possible for pilots to remain in the area and make more than one bombing run. In short, they did better at night than people did during the day. And after the attack, it became obvious that if carrier planes could search and attack effectively at night, there would be no need to wait for the dawn to launch a strike group or search. The enemy would get no sleep and have no chance to prepare his runways, move his planes, or prepare for the next day's attack. Also, as I noted, Admiral Edwin Layton, who was Nimitz's intelligence officer, he noted that despite the fact that the capital ships weren't there, the destruction of the fleet supply train at Truk proved just as effective in curtailing combined fleet operations as would have the sinking of the capital ships. Without their support vessels, Japan's ability to mount offensive operations was ended. After the war, the Japanese admirals I talked to always referred to the raid on Truk as the one that broke their back. They had endured midway in the loss of the carriers and skilled air crews, but our 2-day airstrike in the second week of February was the body blow that caused them to abandon any hope of forward operations thereafter. So that is the story of the raid, but I'd like to talk just a little bit about what happened afterwards. Next slide, please. Because of the success of the raid, William Martin returned as Air Group Commander of Night Air Group 90, which was deployed in 24 December 1944. They turned the Enterprise, this was Martin's dream, into a night carrier. It only operated at night, or it was supposed to, but it also would recover ships during the day if it was, or planes during the day if it was required. Next slide. And again, it becomes USS Enterprise CVN-6. Sailing on 24 December for the Philippines, it carried an air group specially trained in night operations. As the only carrier capable of night operations, she left Oahu with her hull code changed again to CVN. So let's go back to the very beginning. We got a young, ambitious Navy pilot. He has a vision. Nobody will listen to him, but he finds the right plane, the right people, the right radar. He finds the right time to prove his point. And it becomes obvious that this is something that will allow the U.S. Navy to hit the Japanese 24 hours a day. So his work and his goals certainly did come to fruition. All right, so what happened to these people after the war? Next slide. My uncle would go on to not only do well at the night raid on Truk, but he would win the Navy Cross for his actions in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where he, along with his squadron mates, would severely damage a Japanese aircraft carrier. Next slide, please. He also, during the summer of '44, would be given a month's leave, and he would go home and he would make his way to the East Coast, where he would marry his college sweetheart, Jeannie Fleury. Real quick about my Aunt Jeannie. While my uncle was off in the Pacific, Aunt Jeannie applied for medical school at Hopkins. There was a rule that 10% of the class at Hopkins had to be women because they'd received a large donation. And my Aunt Jeannie was one of the 7 women who was chosen. And while, again, my uncle was at war, she was becoming a doctor, and she would eventually become head of children's cardiology at Bellevue Hospital. Uncle Joe would serve on the Enterprise until the midsummer of 1945. Now, during this time on the Enterprise, there was more downtime than had been in the past, largely because the ship had been hit by a kamikaze. The intelligence officer on the Enterprise was a gentleman by the name of Edward Hidalgo, and he liked to mentor and work with the young pilots. And he asked my uncle what he was going to do after the war. And my uncle said, well, I'm going to go back to Georgetown. I'm going to go at night, get my law degree, but I'm going to work at the Bureau of Labor Statistics during the day. Hidalgo said, look, you don't want to do that. If you're going to go to law school, go to one where you can make money. Go to Columbia, where I went. I'll write you a recommendation. And my uncle actually followed up on that recommendation and graduated from Columbia and was able to get a position with, I believe today it's still one of the largest law firms in the world, Sherman and Sterling. Next slide, please. That's Joseph Anthony Doyle. But he not only became a very distinguished lawyer, and this is, I love this story. Toward the end of his career, Jimmy Carter is president, and Ed Hidalgo is Secretary of the Navy. He needs an undersecretary for manpower and reserves. He called up my Uncle Joe and said, I'd like you to come and work for me. My Uncle Joe was a partner of Sherman and Sterling at that point. He was in a position where he could go to the head of the firm and say, I need a couple of years off. The guy said, fine, go ahead. So he actually became undersecretary of the Navy for manpower and reserves for 2 years under the Carter administration. So again, it was an incredible story. One quick story about Aunt Jeannie just shows you how times have changed. When my uncle went to ask for her hand in marriage, her father said, well, Joe, do you want to have children? And he said, yes. My Aunt Jeannie's father was a doctor as well. He said, yes, Dr. Fleury, we do. And he said, well, you can't get married then because Jeannie's going to become a doctor, meaning you can't be a doctor and be a mother at the same time. Thankfully, things have changed. One last story about Charlie Henderson before we conclude. Charlie Henderson and my uncle were both taken aboard the Enterprise. They actually left BT-10 and became part of the night squadron. And there was a period where the leader of the squadron was killed in combat, and most of the pilots went to Bill Martin and said, we want Doyle to take over because Henderson has seniority and we're afraid what will happen if he's in charge. Well, Henderson had seniority and he ended up taking over. But before he mustered out of the Navy, Charlie Henderson proved that they had made a mistake at Pensacola, because during the Marianas campaign in June, as a member of VT-10, he pursued, which is not a good thing to do in a torpedo plane, an Aichi nicknamed Jake long-range reconnaissance seaplane and a Nakajima torpedo bomber. A year later, as a member and eventually commander of VT-90N, he added 2 more, a Nakajima single plane float plane and let's see, and one other, an A6M 0. So he shot down 4 planes in a torpedo bomber, which is almost, it's crazy. but he was able to do it. It's like trying to take on a Ferrari in a Volkswagen bus, but he almost became an ace. A story. Years later, Charlie Henderson decides to start, after he got out of the Navy, a steamship company in the Far East, which he does. He had a lot of disposable income, and he becomes very wealthy. He already was wealthy, and he bought a large ranch in Australia. And my uncle was out in the South Pacific during his time as Undersecretary of the Navy, and he visited Charlie Henderson. And Charlie Henderson said, "Come on, Joe, we're going to go out and we're going to herd cattle. I've got to move the cattle from one end of the ranch to the other." Well, my uncle thought they were going to be in a pickup truck, but they ended up getting into Charlie Henderson's helicopter. And as they're flying over the cattle, Charlie Henderson handed my uncle a shotgun and said, "When you get close to them, I want you to shoot it, and that'll scare them and move them to the other side." Unfortunately, my uncle shot the shotgun with one hand and it kicked, and he had a large bruise on his arm for a very good long time. So even years after their time in the Pacific, Charlie Henderson still was having a profound effect on my uncle's life. All right, so Bill. Oh, I almost forgot. Bill Martin stays in the Navy and achieves flag rank. One cryptologic episode. He is also commander of the 6th Fleet when the Liberty is attacked. And reading his oral history about the Liberty is extremely interesting and tragic. But one of the problems was when the radio contact came over, Martin noted that none of them were authenticated, and all they could hear was just people screaming and yelling. And they really didn't know what was going on. When they finally figured it out, Martin in his oral history noted that he did send fighter planes, and they were about halfway there when he got a flash message to recall them. So he goes on to lead the Navy at a fairly high level. He also was assigned for a brief period at Patuxent Naval Air, and occasionally the planes would go in the drink, and he would be able to swim to shore. This also happened to him several times when he was commanding VT-10. So his time as the captain of the swim team at Annapolis came in very, very handy. All right, to conclude, and then we will take some questions. Last story, at one point in time, probably during that moment when he was home to get married, my uncle approached the house. Could you have the slide of 3711, Miss Hardy? Should be the next one up. That's Bill Martin as Admiral. Next one. There you go. He approached the house early in the morning, and everyone was asleep. So he thought, I don't want to wake everybody up. I'll climb through the kitchen window. And this is from the epilogue of the book. When Doyle passed through that kitchen window for a fleeting moment, he was no longer a vital member of the Buzzard Brigade, but Joe Doyle, the clerk at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who was going to go to law school at night. Passing through the window brought him into a world of peace and love and hope for the future. But Joe could only stay in that world for a moment before heading back and having to pass through other windows that led to a world where life was cheap, and one wrong move might not only result in your death, but also in the death of everyone around you. At the same time, the longer he was in the Navy, the more he understood that while one could lose their life, there were also opportunities to accomplish incredible things and find out things about oneself that could never be revealed in the kitchen of 3711. Years later, in a family history, he would advise his grandchildren, don't always play it safe and don't always do things because it would be fun. Do things to see if you can do it to test yourself, because that's the only way you'll find out what your abilities are. And as I say, if you're in an open competitive society, how you succeed is going to depend on your abilities. When I came to interview at the law firm after graduation, the partner who talked to me had been in the military himself. He asked me what I had done when I was in the Navy. Well, he said, I'm glad you're here. I hope you won't be bored. And my Uncle Joe noted, I was never bored. That completes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm prepared to answer some questions. I'll start with the one that I received, and then I'll go to the ones on the screen. And please, if you have a question, please, it's always a good barometer of how well you did on your talk if you get questions. If you don't get any questions, you can perceive yourself as a failure, and I don't want to do that. Okay. From Miss Gold, could you pick one of your favorite museum exhibits or a favorite event and tell us why it's one of your favorites? That's an easy one, Miss Gold. It's the Midway exhibit. The reason is because Midway to me is the epitome of why we need organizations like the National Security Agency. You've got a situation where you are really in a difficult fix. I won't go over all of the statistics, but the U.S. Navy was not in really good shape to meet the Japanese at the time. They had conquered over 1/7 of the Earth's surface in about 6 months. If they were a football team, they would have been 16-0 and unscored upon. But because of the work of Station Hypo and the fact that the U.S. Navy knew exactly what the Japanese were going to do, we were able to achieve an incredible victory. Now, that was due largely to the courage and bravery of the pilots. But if someone said to me, I want you to justify the existence of NSA in 2 minutes, I'm talking about the Battle of Midway. So that is and always will be my favorite exhibit. I mean, I often tell people, if you want to talk about the civil rights struggle and you want somebody to get an understanding of what it was about, you talk about Rosa Parks. Well, if you want to talk about signals intelligence and cryptologic work, Midway is always the very good example. And I hope that answers your question. Okay, Andrew Niemeyer, great question. At the time of the raid, did all carrier-based U.S. naval aviators routinely qualify for night carrier landings, or was it a special cadre selected and trained? Well, I think I covered that, but I'll go over it again. Bill Martin did this on his own. In fact, he was discouraged. In fact, I think if the Navy had known how much time he was taking training these guys in night operations, they would have told him, forget it. What are you doing? We don't do that kind of stuff. So they were really a very, very unique group. And Martin believed they not only had to be outstanding instrument pilots, but they also had to be able to work with the person in the middle of the plane, to use the radar to be able to find the targets that they needed to find. So again, now from that, as we see, we go from this kind of, spur of the moment thing that Martin was operating, and now we have a fully duly noted nighttime carrier force. So it really did bring the night operations into a whole new environment for the better. Linda Bender. Hello, Miss Bender. How are you? How did you get interested in this topic? What do you hope audiences will learn? Well, that's a great question. That's a fastball right down the middle of the plate. I got interested in it because my uncle was a war hero. He didn't like to talk about it. A lot of the stuff I had to drag out of him, but I interviewed him in 2004 for 3 hours about the raid. I found it incredibly fascinating. Here's what I hope people get out of it for today. 2 things. Number 1, always be willing to innovate and question what's going on. For some reason, the whole time I was preparing this brief, I was thinking about General Alexander and Colonel Nakasone, who's now general. They go over to Iraq and they say, you know, a lot of people are being killed by IEDs over here. You know, are we helping you? And they say, yeah, you know, the intelligence that we get is good, but it goes to Fort Meade and then it comes back over here, and that's a long time. And I'm sure there was a lot of institutional pushback. But Nakasone and General Alexander put their heads together, and I'm sure it wasn't just them. I'm sure they had a lot of people helping them as well. But they came up with this amazing process, which I can't talk about in detail because I don't really know how it works, and also it's probably classified, RTRG, which allowed them to collect everything they needed to get and know so well what the enemy was going to do that they could be standing there when the person was coming down the road to plant the bombs. So that's kind of like a Bill Martin kind of thing where you've got people who say, you know, why don't we do it a little bit differently? Why don't we take a different approach? And the second point that I want people to get from it is, and I'm not a politician, I'm still working for the agency. This is an amazing country. When you think about what we accomplished in World War II, the Enterprise, just one aircraft carrier, how much stuff, how much food, how much ammo, how much did it have to have every day in order to operate? The logistical chain was enormous. It went from one end of the world to the other. And we were able to do this to the point where we just totally vanquished our enemies. We've got to stop fighting as a country and find common ground and really embrace those things that really can make us achieve these wonderful things again. And I hate to say it because I used to read this stuff in the history books and say, it'll never happen again. But it's scary, and I worry for my children and grandchildren, but it's starting to look like 1938, 39 again. And we had better be ready. And hopefully, if we do have to go to war, God forbid, we're going to have people involved like these individuals who can rise to the occasion. Okay, other questions. Here we go. The digital book is available. I hate to hawk this stuff. I didn't write it to make money, but the digital book is available. You can get it, both the audio book and you can get the digital version as well. All you have to do is go on Mr. Bezos's business there, Amazon. How did the VT-10 sell their leader of the air group and the ship's CO on practice night flight operations on and off the Enterprise? Most of the training that he had done at night, they had already completed before they got onto the ship. So I don't know exactly, and I should. I mean, I could certainly find out. But I don't think they were able to really practice their craft once they flew out and got onto the Enterprise until Martin finally gave them the chance. And that's another testament to the fact that during that training at both Seattle and Hawaii, they had learned how to do it, and it wasn't going to be a problem. I mean, when you think about how badly Martin wanted to go on that raid, and then all of a sudden he can't go, but yet Eason is able to step right in, and as the after action report notes, they did a super job. Did the tip on saving fuel become any semblance of standard procedurally or minimally a tip distributed throughout the pilots and crews? Gosh, these are great questions, man. You guys are great. You know, I never did ask my uncle, but I would imagine it was probably, what's it, common law or whatever. I think there were probably a lot of people who knew that. But I don't know that it ever became chapter and verse or part of the regular approach, mainly because I don't know, you know, Don Foth was right and my uncle got back to the ship, but I don't know if you do that over a long period of time, it can damage the engine. I'm not sure. But that's a great, great question. And I thank you for it. Are you working on another book? Yes, I am, but it's not about this stuff. It's about ice hockey. So if you like ice hockey, stay tuned. I'm going to be there. Most people don't know it, but real quick, Laura, the very first collegiate hockey game ever in the history of the United States was held between Yale and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And this was a first, and I'd like to write about that game because hockey was in its infancy. So there you go. I want to thank everybody. I hope it was informative. I will tell you that if you have additional questions or you want to converse about this, my email is pweadon@yahoo.com. Feel free to email me or call me or whatever, because I love to talk about it. And it's a labor of love for me. But I once again want to thank Laura. I want to thank the foundation. There's more questions. Wait a minute.
I'm sorry.
Hold on. That's all right. This is good. Okay. Did the tip on saving? Yes, I've already talked about that. Are you working on another book? Yes. I'm sorry.
It's down
Oh,
here.
there's more. I'm sorry. Okay. Truk has since become a wreck diving destination. It was also, have you visited there? No. And I have to tell you, one of the people who I admire is Robert Caro, who wrote the books on Johnson. He doesn't write anything unless he goes there. So he spent time in the hill country. He's in Vietnam now because he's writing the last version of Johnson's life. Going there is really important. And I would have loved to go, but I'm a retired government employee. So I don't have a lot of money to be going off to Truk. I will tell you this one thing that I think might be interesting to people. Hopefully, if you had relatives and they were in the DC area, they invested in real estate in Chevy Chase, because my grandfather bought the house that we looked at for $22,000 in 1935. And last year it sold for $1.3 million in 2 days. Now, I'm not going to see any of it goes into a trust. But again, if I had gotten that money, if I had gotten $1.2 million instead of it going into a trust, I definitely would have gone to Truk and I would have spent a long time there. But it was a bit of a bridge too far. It is a diving destination. And for those of you that go there, you can see some of the handiwork of Joe Doyle and Charlie Henderson and Commander Eason and the rest of the group, because 13 of the ships that are on the bottom of Truk Lagoon were sunk by VT-10 that night. All right. Talk tactics and strategy. Great generals talk. Oh, there you go. That is so true. Again, Ian Toll, who is an outstanding author. He has a trilogy on the Pacific War. He pays excruciating detail to the logistic challenges that the United States faced. I was talking about with somebody this morning, the island of Tinian, where the B-29s took off to drop the atomic bomb. At the end of the war, when the Americans left, they had about 10 warehouses full of whatever, food, 2x4s, I mean, you name it. And it was common for the islanders on Tinian, years after the Americans left, if they needed something, they would just drive out to one of these warehouses. It was like having Home Depot where you don't have to pay. So it's stunning to me how much this country was able to accomplish. And again, we need to remember that because we have incredible potential, just need to harness it. And I think that's it. Any others? All right. Godspeed, everybody. And well, Laura and the foundation and everybody out there, thank you very, very much. I wish you all the best. Thank you.
All right, I'll do a quick wrap up.
All right. Thanks. How did I do on time?
You did a very perfect time.
Good.
Well, thank you everybody for participating today. Christine's going to throw up a last slide with a couple of things on it. But a few administrative notes before we go. I don't know if many of you know, but we had an office at the museum for many years. Once they did the rehabilitation there recently, they have more staff. So we left that, and we are now all in one location at Landmark Drive in Glen Burnie, and therefore we've changed our address. So any kind of mailings or anything you do, we no longer have a Fort Meade post office. Everything is to 808 Landmark Drive, Suite 223 in Glen Burnie. So that's number one on the list. The other I'd like to mention is we are finally very much officially the National Cryptologic Foundation. Even though we changed our name 2 years ago, it takes a lot of time for the IRS to catch up. And we finally last week got that official notification that our name is officially changed according to as a charitable organization. So that's really exciting. Finally, we do have a brand new education director who I'm going to introduce formally at the general membership meeting, but her name is Dr. Alicia Jordan, and she has been here a couple of months, and she has been focusing and moving forward on getting our podcast series out, and it's called our Cyber Chat Podcasts. And on the screen, you can see where you can reach that. It's geared towards kids, youth, 11 to 18 years old. Or to any adults who just want to listen. So please check it out if you get a chance. And the other, we have our newest Amanita White Hat computer game that has been launched in beta testing. And we need feedback before we can officially launch the game. And if anybody's interested, you can see that link on the screen as well. Well, before I go again, thank you so much to Patrick Weadon for that fascinating talk and learning a little bit about his family history as well as we went along. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Truk and other things that go on. And I hope you all enjoyed it as well. We look forward to seeing you all at the general membership meeting in May. We will have dates soon. We're still looking at venues for that. But once we have that, we will have an in-person event, and we look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you very much.